The money does not always vanish with a bang. Sometimes it disappears like air leaking from a tire. One missed paycheck, one sick child, one layoff, one bad winter that eats the savings you did not have. And in the hills, when the cash ran out, the kitchen did not get to panic. The kitchen had to keep going. A jar of grease on the shelf, a sack of flour, a few potatoes in a crate, a canning jar of beans, a garden that might be thin but still trying. This was the quiet math of survival. Now, the title of this video says illegal, and that word matters. Because in hard years, some families admitted they did not just stretch recipes. They stretched rules. Not for excitement, not for profit, for supper, for children, for dignity on the table when the wallet was empty. This is not a how-to. It is a remembering. A look back at pantry tricks people whispered about, laughed about later, or never talked about at all. Tricks that lived in the gray area between need and law, between pride and hunger. And one of the most surprising tricks was not about a secret ingredient. It was about a secret place. Food hidden in plain sight, so it could not be taken, counted, or controlled. We'll get there. In many rural parts of Appalachia and the Ozarks, cash work could be seasonal and unpredictable. Some families lived in company towns where the company store shaped what you could buy and what you could afford. In some places, wages were even tied up in scrip, a kind of company-issued money that could push families toward one store and one price tag, whether they liked it or not. Refrigeration was not always a given. Electricity arrived unevenly across the countryside, and many homes relied on root cellars, smokehouses, and spring houses to keep food cool. A spring house could hold milk and butter near cold running water, like a natural refrigerator that never needed a plug. So when money vanished, people leaned on what kept. Cornmeal, beans, salt pork, potatoes, and whatever the land could offer, if you had the knowledge and the nerve. These are 25 illegal hillbilly pantry tricks that fed families when money vanished. Each one is a small scene, a small reveal, a glimpse into how people made not enough become enough, at least for tonight. The first trick begins with something most people today throw away without thinking. The grease jar was a pantry treasure. Bacon grease and pork drippings saved in a jar, used to fry potatoes, season greens, or turn flour and water into gravy. People relied on it because fat carried calories and made plain food taste like comfort. It mattered because a single spoon of grease could make a pot of beans smell like meat, even when there was no meat. The human detail is the spoon scraping the jar, careful and slow, because everybody knew that jar had to last. From that grease jar came a meal that was almost a symbol of making do. Flour gravy over bread was what happened when the pantry was down to basics. A little fat, flour, salt, and water or milk when there was any, turned into warm gravy poured over bread. Some families added black pepper, like it was a luxury. People ate it because it filled the stomach fast and made a small pantry feel like a meal. It mattered because warm food can quiet fear. The human detail is the bread soaking through, eaten slowly, because even a thin meal feels safer when it lasts. And if there were potatoes, the same trick could stretch into a different shape. Boiled potatoes with gravy was plain, but it worked. Potatoes boiled until tender, then covered with gravy made from drippings when possible, or from flour and water when nothing else existed. People ate it because potatoes were cheap calories and stored well in a cool place. It mattered because you could feed a family without buying meat. The human detail is the steam rising off a chipped bowl and hands hovering close, warming fingers before the first bite. When beans were on the shelf, another trick turned one pot into several days of security. Soup beans on rotation meant one pot of pinto beans could serve as dinner, then lunch, then dinner again, thickening as days passed. A ham bone or fatback might flavor it if the family had it, but many relied on salt and time alone. People ate it because beans were cheap protein that stored well. It mattered because a big pot was something you could count on. The human detail is the lid lifting again and again, as if checking the pot was the same as checking hope. To go with those beans, the pantry leaned on bread that did not need much. Hot water cornbread was a fast bread made from cornmeal, hot water, salt, and sometimes a little fat. It could be cooked quickly and eaten hot, broken by hand. People ate it because it used cheap staples and made any pot feel bigger. It mattered because bread turns a bowl into a meal. The human detail is the crumb on the table, brushed into a fingertip and eaten without a second thought. But what many people forget is how often the poor man meal became a poor man drink too. Cornbread and buttermilk was eaten from a bowl, especially when time was short. Cornbread crumbled into buttermilk, sometimes salted, sometimes sweetened lightly if sugar was around. People ate it because it was quick and filling, and it used leftovers without waste. It mattered because mornings were rushed and hunger was real. The human detail is the cold bowl in your hands, cornbread softening as you eat, while the day outside still looks hard. Now we come to the first illegal edge, and it is not a recipe. It is a decision. Hidden gardens behind the house were a quiet trick in some places. Families tucked small gardens behind sheds, along fence lines, or in less obvious spots. The ingredients were whatever would grow: beans, greens, potatoes, squash. People did it because a visible garden could be vulnerable in desperate times, and sometimes even to control or judgment in certain communities. It mattered because hidden food is protected food. The human detail is the child sent out to check it, not to play, but to guard supper. When a garden could not do enough, people looked beyond the fence. Gleaning after harvest meant collecting what was left behind after fields were picked. Corn left low on stalks. Potatoes missed in the dirt. Apples fallen and bruised. In some places this was tolerated. In others it crossed into trespassing. People did it because wasted food looked like an insult when kids were hungry. It mattered because gleaning turned leftovers of the land into meals at home. The human detail is the sack carried back in silence, heavy and muddy, like it was something precious. From gleaning, the hills offered another pantry if you knew what you were looking at. Foraged greens from the edges were gathered from roadsides, creek banks, and hillsides. Dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, wild mustard, and other edible plants people recognized. The meal was often greens cooked down with a spoon of grease and salt. People did it because it was free food when money vanished. It mattered because greens brought nutrients when diets leaned hard on starch. The human detail is the wash basin, leaves swirled and cleaned because you were eating the outdoors. And one of the most famous and most misunderstood was a plant outsiders called a weed. Poke greens, sometimes called poke salad, were eaten in some communities when gathered young and prepared by people who knew the traditional methods. Pokeweed can be dangerous if mishandled, and families who cooked it often treated that knowledge like a family tool. People did it because it was early spring food when the pantry felt long and empty. It mattered because knowledge could be a form of wealth. The human detail is the caution in the kitchen, the way only certain hands handled poke because safety was part of the recipe. When spring arrived, another wild food announced itself with a smell you could not ignore. Ramps fried with potatoes was a classic mountain plate. Wild ramps, strong like onion and garlic, cooked with sliced potatoes in a skillet, often in saved grease. People ate it because ramps were free and full of flavor after winter's plain food. It mattered because one skillet could feed many with almost no cash spent. The human detail is the smell drifting into clothes and curtains and the way it seemed to follow you, like the whole house had eaten it. Now we step into a different kind of illegal, not about plants, but about meat. Out-of-season small game was a reality in hard years, even though game laws existed for a reason. Rabbits and squirrels could become stew or gravy when there was no money for store meat. People did it because hunger can push people into choices they do not brag about. It mattered because protein mattered, especially for working bodies. The human detail is the quiet at the table because nobody wanted children repeating the story outside the house. Along the same line, fish could mean the difference between just cornbread and a real meal. Creek fish supper was often pan-fried fish or a simple fish stew made from whatever was caught locally. In some places, fishing without the proper license or in restricted areas could cross the line. People did it because fish was food that did not require a butcher or cash. It mattered because it added protein and variety to a tight pantry. The human detail is the smell of hot oil and crisping skin, and everyone suddenly watching the pan like it is important. Then there was a darker story that some families remembered with a wince. Accident meat stew was the polite way some people talked about meat that came from the roadside. Not everyone did it. Not every story is the same. But the idea appears in memory because desperation was real. The meal was often a stew because stew could make tough meat edible and stretch it with potatoes. People did it because wasting meat felt impossible in a hungry house. It mattered because it shows how close to the edge some families lived. The human detail is the way nobody named it at the table. It was just stew. Back in the pantry, another trick was not about finding more meat. It was about making meat disappear into a pot. Meat as seasoning. Not the main event meant a small piece of salt pork, a ham bone, or a strip of bacon could flavor a whole pot of beans, greens, or potatoes. People relied on it because a little meat could make plain food feel like dinner. It mattered because it stretched expensive ingredients across multiple meals. The human detail is the bone itself, moved from one pot to the next like it had a job to do until it gave up its last bit of flavor. And when meat truly ran out, some kitchens pushed thrift to the limit. Potato peel soup was made in some homes when nothing could be wasted, not even the skins. Peel simmered in salted water or broth, sometimes with onion, then thickened with a little flour or finished with a splash of milk when possible. People ate it because even scraps contain calories, and hunger does not allow pride. It mattered because it marked the last line of making do. The human detail is the careful washing before peeling, because what used to be trash was now supper. From scraps, we moved to something that sounds small, but could change everything. The onion's job was to add big flavor when there was not much else. One onion could make potatoes taste deeper, make beans smell richer, make a thin soup feel like something real. People relied on onions because they were cheap and stored well. It mattered because flavor is appetite, and appetite is survival. The human detail is the onion skins gathered in a pile, then tossed into the stove or saved for compost, because even waste had a purpose. In kitchens where sweetness disappeared first, families reached for older sweeteners. Sorghum and molasses stretch was used when sugar was scarce or too expensive. A little sorghum on biscuits, a spoon in oatmeal, a drizzle over cornbread. In many rural communities, sorghum was more than a flavor. It was a seasonal ritual boiled down from cane into dark syrup that could last. People did it because it provided quick energy and made plain food feel comforting. The human detail is sticky fingers wiped on a rag, because syrup does not care what kind of day you have. And when dessert felt impossible, the pantry still found a way to bring back the taste of fruit. Dried apples reborn were soaked and cooked down into fried apples, apple butter, or simple fillings. People relied on dried fruit because it stored well and turned winter into something bearable. It mattered because dried fruit meant the orchard did not vanish when leaves fell. The human detail is the smell of warm apple rising from a pan, changing the mood of the whole house before anyone takes a bite. Then came a trick that feels like a magic act because it imitated what people missed. Mock apple pie showed up in some households as a way to recreate a familiar dessert feeling without expensive fruit. Recipes varied from place to place, and the point was not perfection. The point was normal. People did it because traditions mattered, even when money vanished. It mattered because morale is part of survival, especially for children who still wanted birthdays and Sundays to feel real. The human detail is the first slice served with quiet pride, because pulling off the illusion felt like a victory. Now we shift into preservation, because when money vanished, the pantry had to last. Reusing canning jars and lids was a common practice when supplies were scarce. During certain periods, including wartime shortages, new canning lids could be harder to get, and families reused what they could. This could be risky, but risk and hunger often live close together. People did it because store supplies cost money they did not have. It mattered because canned food is winter insurance. The human detail is the tiny ping of a lid sealing, a small sound that meant security. If canning required jars and lids, drying required only time and air. Leather breeches were green beans strung and dried, then cooked later when winter hit. The ingredients were beans, thyme, and a pot for cooking them back to tenderness, often with a little pork for flavor if possible. People relied on drying because it preserved food without ice, without electricity, without anything fancy. It mattered because it carried summer into cold months. The human detail is the memory of beans hanging in strands in the kitchen, like decorations that were actually dinner. And sometimes families preserved more than one crop together because the pantry had to be efficient. Shucky beans, often corn and beans dried together, were cooked into a thick, hearty pot later on. The ingredients were dried corn and beans, water, salt, and sometimes a bit of meat for flavor. People did it because it saved space and built a complete meal from stored food. It mattered because it reduced dependence on cash and storage.